Early access. These two words tend to harbor some negative emotions about whatever game they come into contact with. I think that sometimes early access as a program gets a bad rap, but even I can admit that sometimes seeing that blue sticker on a game's description page is somewhat of a turnoff. Do you know what I like better than games that are in early access? Games that have been out of early access for years, like Ziggurat. I figured I would open this video talking about Ziggurat's early access history because it's surprisingly brief. A lot of early access horror stories come from games stuck there indefinitely, but Ziggurat first hit Steam Early Access in August of 2014 with a Steam release in October of the same year. That's a 2-month difference. Pretty incredible. The game went on to see a full console release in the years that followed, but this version I'm reviewing today is based on that Steam PC release. So, did Ziggurat come out the other end of the early access program feeling like a complete and worthwhile experience? Yeah, it totally did. Alright, so I bet I can guess your first question. How do you make a game based off of an ancient Mesopotamian stone structure? Well, you make it a dungeon crawling roguelike FPS with magic instead of guns. It's pretty funny to see what sort of parallels Ziggurat draws between its magic arsenal and its real-world counterparts. Shotguns are replaced with grimoires, machine guns are replaced with staves, grenades are still just grenades. So the basic gameplay loop involves you navigating your way through the floors of the Ziggurat. Each floor is broken down into multiple different rooms, and each room has a different randomized challenge. Sometimes this challenge will be a first-person platforming section you must navigate your way through, and other times it'll be a combat scenario of some sort. Your goal on each floor is to find a key, which opens up the boss room, and take down the boss itself. Taking down the boss will have you descend to the next floor, where you repeat this process over and over again until you've conquered all 5 floors of the Ziggurat. It's a pretty simple formula, and the fact that the average floor only takes 10 to 15 minutes means that you're looking at a game that's easily digestible for doing one run per sitting. Like any good roguelike, the goal isn't to play through the game once and see the ending, but instead to challenge yourself and beat the game over and over again, utilizing different strategies each time. The game has a lot of different ways with which it encourages this kind of behavior. So when you first boot up the game, you're only going to have a choice between 2 basic main characters to play as, but subsequent runs will have you unlocking alternate choices. Each of the characters has different perks and drawbacks that they bring to the table, giving you a good amount of selection with how you want your run to start. Don't get used to having that level of freedom once you delve inside, though. Ziggurat heavily leans into its roguelike style by having a heavy amount of randomness. It's a game that isn't supposed to be pre-planned and mathed out ahead of time, but instead, it's a game that begs you to respond to external forces out of your control and making the best of bad situations. Nowhere is this more apparent than with the weapon you start with. The weapon you get at the beginning of each run is entirely random, and, of course, it's possible for you to get stuck with a crappy one. Sure, you have your faithfully ever-present wand as a backup weapon, but you're sure to take some heavy damage in the early game utilizing such a basic tool. And that's part of what makes this game so much fun. The high level of unpredictability and your response to it will determine how far you can descend. Now, although your starting weapon may be completely random, the perks you get upon leveling up give you a choice between 2. This system, while still random, gives you just enough agency to nudge a build in a particular direction while still not being totally predetermined. All the floor layouts are random too, and hell, there's even a system where you can offer up some of your resources to pray to the gods, and they may reward you with beneficial perks or smite you with tragic debuffs based totally on their whim. Now I know what you might be thinking, all of these random variables may seem like they're a little too much, and they definitely would have been, had the game not had one area where you are 100% in control all the time, and that's the combat. Though yes, the scenarios you are placed into are random themselves, your sharpshooting capabilities most certainly will not be. From the moment you start moving around, you will instantly notice just how fast this game is. Camera sensitivity defaults to a crazy high amount, and your default movement speed is way faster than I'm used to. Almost all enemy attacks sent your way are projectiles that can be dodged, just as the shots you send back at them can be. Ziggurat is incredibly responsive and quick and old school. It takes a lot of inspiration from id Software classics like Hexen and Heretic, but the comparison that comes to my mind first is something like Serious Sam. no reloading, breakneck speed, wide combat arenas, and lots of jumping around. If you've grown cynical at the pace of modern games and their cover systems, then definitely look no further. The high-speed action here makes it so that you need to think quickly, and the largest thought going through your mind during combat is likely going to be one of resource allocation. Rather than having ammunition for specific weapons, the game has mana pools that are used across all weapons of a certain type, each corresponding to a different color. Blue is your spell magic, green is your staff magic, and orange is your alchemy magic. You acquire more mana by defeating enemies, but the mana is never guaranteed to drop, making it so that you always have to think carefully about how you choose to spend it. It can be tense determining whether or not you want to unload all of your resources into the current room, or save it because you know a boss is coming up, and that tension is one that you'll need to strategically navigate through if you wish to be successful. Don't become too distracted thinking about all of your abilities though, otherwise you might forget to dodge your opponents. Like I mentioned, basically all the attacks in this game are projectiles, allowing you to narrowly get your way out of attacks. All the enemy projectiles are well highlighted on your screen, making it very easy to see incoming blasts. At times, the sheer quantity of enemies and projectiles on screen made this game feel like a shmup, so any fans of the bullet hell genre will definitely have a good time stretching their legs here in some of these combat scenarios. The enemies themselves also have very well defined silhouettes and color schemes, making them easy to identify and adapt to once they are in a room. Hulking golems send outward radial blasts based on their location, while flying skulls make a flying dive bomb right at you. All the game's different enemy types are ones that require a different strategy to play around. On the normal difficulty, descending through the game's 5 floors isn't all that difficult. I had my first completion within the first 2 hours of play, but all roguelike fans know that I've only just begun. I think how well a roguelike plays is based on how well it can differentiate multiple runs between each other, and Ziggurat has a couple of different ways in which it accomplishes this. The first being the room modifiers. In addition to the layout of the room and the enemies within it being random, a random modifier of some sort can be placed on top of the scenario itself. Some of these are pretty basic, like buffing up certain weapon types or nerfing others. Other modifiers may see enemies within a certain room grow and shrink at random, and I definitely encountered a room or two on my adventure that took away a few elements of my heads-up display and expected me to take down my foes without looking at my health and mana bars. The next way with which Ziggurat manages to make each run feel unique is how the different build types in the game play out. It starts with your character itself, like I mentioned before, but the way in which your perks go from there can make 2 different runs feel more like 2 different games. In one of my runs, I ended up leaning really heavily into my default wand weapon and acquiring perks that buffed it up to the extreme, at the cost of all other weapon types. In a totally different build, I tried to maximize how often I leveled up by utilizing bonus experience perks, and combined that with a perk that gave me more perks when I leveled up. By the time I hit the final boss, I was an overleveled badass with more power-ups than I knew what to do with. On top of how perks and weapons can change how you play a given run, you'll also run into some amulets. Amulets are abilities you can activate once every couple of minutes to give yourself some sort of boost, like increased attack speed or some sort of healing factor. Now there is one way in which I feel the game doesn't go far enough for subsequent playthroughs, and that is the layout of the rooms and floors themselves. The game feels rigidly square at times. Square rooms, square pillars, square traps. It may sound a bit nitpicky, but the lack of any real curvature anywhere in this game makes it feel like you're playing on a grid. And yes, the layouts of each room get very familiar very quickly. By my second playthrough, I feel like I had seen every different shape and size of the room, even if the challenge within that room may have been different each time. Visual variety can feel a bit lacking too. While the game has a nice aesthetic, and the more subdued color palette contrasts well with the game's loud spell effects, it's not an aesthetic that sees any significant change as you descend through the floors. While you technically see shifts in setting from a cathedral to a fortress and more, the key is that none of it really feels different. If you showed me a screenshot from any given floor in the game, I feel like I'd be hard-pressed to tell you anything significant about the floor it was taken from. So, what is there to do after you've had your fill playing through the game's 5 floors multiple times? You have a few different options in terms of alternate game modes. The first is Gauntlet, which sees you fight in a single combat arena against a wave and wave of enemy, like Horde mode from Gears of War. Gauntlet just feels like less of the main game, and without a lot of what made it cool, like the modifiers, so it isn't something that I'd recommend. On the flip side, there's an Endless mode. What's a roguelike game without an infinitely scaling challenge? Endless mode is just like the base game, except that it continues on after floor 5. This ended up being my preferred mode, even to the base game, as the potential to take your run to infinite success is a huge incentive. Making a build that is much more scalable to more than just the first 5 floors gives an additional layer of thought to your playthrough as well. The big bummer here is that you can't play endless mode on a character unless you've beaten the game on normal with said character. It shackled me to forcing my way through 5 levels of the base game over and over again with a few different characters in order to get to the mode that I really cared about. I feel like beating the base game with any character could have been enough to unlock the endless mode for everyone. Lastly, you have the daily challenge. The game has a daily Ziggurat, which is a predefined layout for all players who challenge it, who are then stacked up against each other on a leaderboard. There are no retries here, so you're judged more on your ability to react to the game's unique challenge rather than practicing over and over again for perfection. Now, you may be wondering why I haven't touched on this game's story at all, and that's because there isn't one. Okay, well, there's technically a story. There are some powerful wizards who convene every 10 years and test their apprentices by having them go through the Ziggurat. That apprentice is you, by the way. Yeah, really, that's kind of the extent of the story. There are like 3 minutes of cutscenes max, spread across the entire game. One at the beginning, and one at the end. I can't fault the game too hard in the story department. Yeah, it's pretty boring and uninspired, but it also doesn't really exist at all. I mean, the story takes up like 0.00002% of the time you're going to spend here. It's just kind of a missed opportunity to make a potentially cool Mesopotamian myth-based adventure. So, that's Ziggurat, an early access success story. Its replayability and tight combat make it a great pick up and play for an hour at a time, but there are enough smart design decisions here that make it just as much fun to sink your teeth into for long stretches of time, like I did. Its story and setting don't do a whole lot to win you over, but the addictiveness of the gameplay certainly will. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what your thoughts were on this game and if you have any thoughts on what next games I should cover. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to let me know if I'm doing a good job. Till next time.